Hello, everyone. This week we are talking about Romanticism and Into the Wild. I am excited to talk about these topics because the topic of Romanticism is really interesting, both in colloquial language, so how we think about it every day, how it's seeped into the main culture, and then simply the academic term for Romanticism, which is slightly different than how we think about it in the main culture, but influential nonetheless in what we see in today's media, especially in things like romantic comedies that are derivative of this idea of romanticism. Secondly, our text Into the Wild, I will admit, is one of my favorite books of all time. So I'm very excited to dig into it again. It is by John Krakauer, and we will get to him in a moment. But first, let's talk about romanticism. So there's lots of definitions. So if you just Google romanticism, it's interesting to see how it's defined across various genres, meaning literary versus academic, mainstream. They're all going to have a different idea in terms of romantic. So when I'm talking about romanticism, I'm referring to the philosophical and literary movement called Romanticism. So this is a movement in the arts and literature that originated in the late 18th century, emphasizing inspiration, subjectivity, and the primacy of the individual. It's hard today to understand what a huge transition this was for culture, because we are very subjective, individualistic beings now, especially if you are from the United States or currently living in the United States. America in particular is an incredibly individualistic country. It is not a collectivist country in any shape or form. And so this idea of romanticism is somewhat core to the idea of America. Of course, it's more than that. It's not just a political movement, but it's hard to understand how important and how big of a change this was unless you think about collective cultures and how people had political thought before romanticism. And of course, today, there's plenty of cultures that see the primacy of the individual while also understanding themselves as being part of a collective. But it could definitely be argued that in the United States of America, you will not see a more individualistic culture. And then, of course, the derivative of romantic idea, of subjectivity, of inspiration, of romantic relationships, again, is quite strong. If you compare those ideas against other cultures in terms of what relationships mean and what things like marriage mean and what sort of commitments we owe one another, it is just, we are on an extreme in the United States of America for sure. But if we think about romanticism just in terms of its academic focus or its academic influence, you will see how it has definitely seeped into literature, the arts, culture, media, the philosophy, politics. For our purposes, we want to think about literature and the environment. So this week, we want to think about romanticism in the environment. So what does it mean to emphasize inspiration, subjectivity, and the primacy of the individual in nature with the environment? What would that look like? Why would that be important? Why would people want to do that? Why is it different? And how is it different than what people used to do? And in that way, we are now reaching a niche where I would say that emphasis of environmental romanticism is not mainstream in the United States. So this is a specific niche that is quite different. Someone like Thoreau is actually countercultural to the American experiment in terms of his romanticism of rejecting capitalism and progress. So lots of different ways to be thinking about how people went along and moved with this movement and how people resist movements at the same time. One way to think about Romanticism, and this is just one way, so I'm not suggesting this is the most important way, but it's useful for our purposes in literature and the environment to think about the flaneur. So if any of you have taken French, my North Dakotan accent will do it no justice, but I will try my best. The flaneur is a French noun referring to a person, literally meaning stroller, lounger, saunterer, or loafer, but with some nuanced additional meanings. Flânerie is the act of strolling with all of its accompanying associations. Now, this definition is from Wikipedia, and it's actually the definition I like best, because if you just Google flaneur, you will see a lot of definitions that are actually quite negative, that make the flaneur sound like they're lazy, lounger or loafer are a little bit more dismissive types of synonyms of the flaneur. But in terms of Romanticism and thinking about the flaneur and the environment, it's someone who walks through the city. And it does start with the city. It doesn't have to be the city, but that's kind of the conception of the flaneur, is someone who has rejected this capitalist idea of working 8 to 8. Now we think 8 to 5, but back then it was much longer. So rejects this idea of working constantly and is instead walking through the city and just trying to absorb what's around them. So they're always listening, they're always writing, they're always watching, and they're just trying to absorb what's going on around them. And then it turns into writing. And so when you think about this in terms of literature and the environment, it's a quite important concept, because without some flaneur activity, we could never write about our environment. We have to be using our senses. We have to be watching and listening and smelling and tasting. With face-to-face students, I have done a exercise where we go outside and we use all of our senses that we are able to use, from seeing to hearing to smelling to tasting to touching, and then we write about it, just what's around us. And it's quite incredible, because oftentimes it's easy to dismiss our surroundings as being everyday or not as exciting as something in National Geographic. But if you really pay attention, like a flaneur would, and really try to see, hear, smell, taste, even think about, what are you tasting right now? Like I can taste my tea, I can taste my dinner. There's lots of sensations going on just right now as I sit here recording this video. What meaning can you make of your surroundings? And so the flaneur is quite romantic in the academic terms, because it's very subjective, it's very individualistic, this walking and sauntering and absorbing the city around them, and then putting that into meaning through writing. And so we will then go to Into the Wild by Jon Krakauer, which once you start reading, you'll probably see some of these connections between Romanticism and the flaneur right away. And it's something that you should try to do as well, if you have the ability to just try to walk and think with your senses. And we will see with Jon Krakauer that he does this. So Into the Wild is a nonfiction story of Chris McCandless. So this is a true story about Chris McCandless. I'm not going to give away much in terms of summary. I will let you read. I think that's quite important. But I will say that the author, Jon Krakauer, this is not his first novel. He's a naturalist. He does extreme sport. So he has many novels in which he is rendering the environment through writing, like a flaneur would. And this story was first introduced as a single article in Outside magazine. And so Jon Krakauer, a journalist, a writer, was interested in this story. And this one article generated so much interest that he did actually write a novel, which also has become incredibly popular. And even though it's relatively new-ish, just over 20 years old, it is becoming canonical. And so it quickly captured the hearts, the romantic hearts of Americans, and has become popular very quickly. And so as you start reading, some questions I'd like you to think about in this first half of the novel is just, how would you describe McCandless? So we have started using some important terms such as sense of place and romanticism, flaneur, in literature and the environment. How would any of those, or maybe none of them, apply to Chris McCandless? So what do you think about that? And how would you relate to these themes? So I hope you enjoy the reading for this week. I hope you can put yourself in the shoes a bit of both John Krakauer and Chris McCandless. They will occupy different parts of the novel as writer and subject. And then also, if you get the chance to try to think about your own ability to be a flaneur. So you'll see it through John Krakauer, you'll see it through Chris McCandless, but how can you see it just in your own life? And then eventually, we also want to think about, why might this be important? Why might this be helpful? And we can talk about that more in the second part. So happy reading. Very excited for you to start this novel, and we will talk about it more in the second half.